Thanks for joining today. My name is Rob Gould. I'm from Barker, and we help clients across the education sector manage their estates and capital projects effectively. This webinar is part of the Confederation of School Trusts and Blue Sky Education's programme of CPD, focused very much around obviously the current coronavirus crisis. And it goes without saying that we're living in unprecedented times at the moment. The landscape shifting on seemingly like a daily basis in terms of legislation, and planning, guidance, protocols, best practice, and the like. And although there are a huge number of tasks to be undertaken in terms of running our schools, getting them back online, we're obviously seeing a lot of questions in our company and our industry raised specifically around the estates management function. So the purpose of today is really to try and keep this session quite focused on estates, on buildings and construction. And we may stray a little bit into facilities management. There's obviously an element of crossover there. So what I want to cover today really is three main areas. First of all, talk about some nuts and bolts of the practicalities of running your buildings, really, specifically concentrating on actions to be taken now whilst you have either a closed site or sites with reduced occupancy, and then also actions to be taken in the run up to the wider reopening that is now being talked about, and in whatever form that might be. We've got a checklist that will help you cover the key areas, and I'll run through that in a bit more detail. I then want to talk about project delivery and construction projects. Those of you in the larger trusts will have received your school condition allocation recently, and you'll be looking at now how that funding is deployed across your estate. And those in smaller trusts or standalone academies will no doubt be waiting on the CIF announcement, Condition Improvement Fund, which we've recently found out has now been delayed from the early May, as indicated by Rory Kennedy, to hopefully May, but late May. You may have existing or ongoing projects that were already started when the coronavirus crisis hit, that have been affected by the lockdown restrictions. There are lots of questions to answer around how and even whether construction works can take place, and what the contractual implications might be, for example, on delays to work caused by the coronavirus and the government's response to it. And finally, I wanted to try and just end on something slightly more positive maybe, and just talk about some of the opportunities that there might be at this time in terms of taking stock of your buildings and estates, reviewing estates strategy, and seeing what good can potentially come out of this situation. Just as a general note, I've put a bit more information and text on these webinar slides than I normally would for a presentation. Sometimes this is just to illustrate a point or indicate some guidance that you can review later. But I'll issue the slides later at the end of the event. And obviously any of the specific resources that we've referred to, we'll either send out as attachments or as links, so that you can read them at your leisure later on. And finally, please do submit some questions, either during the session using the Q&A tab at the side, or you can email me directly and I'll put my details at the end. And obviously you can contact us on our regular contact form on our website. It's just me today, so I'm not sure whether I'm going to be able to be in a position to moderate and sift out questions and resolve them in the live sort of webinar environment. We'll see how we're doing for time as well. But what I propose to do is review all of the questions that are submitted, either online or by email, and any common areas I'll issue some written responses and send them out to all of you that have registered and attended the event in a sort of a pack at the end. So just briefly introduce the company. If you're not familiar with us, Barker, we're architects, surveyors, property consultants, specialising in the education sector. We've been operating in this area for over 30 years, working with schools, academies, particularly academies and trusts, as well as the early years and FE and HE. in both the state-funded and the independent sector. And we deal with everything from surveys and planned maintenance work through to capacity, curriculum planning, expansion. But our bread and butter is designing and managing capital projects from 50,000 to maybe 10 million pounds. One of the particular areas that we've been developing in the last few years is strategic advice on estates planning, access to funding and energy strategy. We work with most of the largest trusts in the country, and we're the Confederation of School Trusts preferred property consultancy, and it's CST who have asked us to put on this webinar for their members to answer some of the specific questions that have been put to them as well around COVID-19 and the running of your estates. So if you are a trust and you're not a member of CST, I'd encourage you to look into membership. This crisis has been a perfect example of sharing best practice and how an organisation like CST can advocate and lobby at the highest levels of government to put forward the concerns and questions that people in our sector have got. So to get onto the sort of core of the webinar presentation, what we've been asked about more than anything at the moment are the practical questions about managing estates, particularly statutory compliance during the crisis. So we're going to look at actions to be taken now whilst you've got either your closed site or reduced occupancy, and then some actions to be taken either now or thinking about in the run up to the wider reopening. As with virtually everything in the health and safety arena, rather than a 100% definitive set of rules and guidelines, often the approach to be taken is that of a risk assessed approach. What we mean by that is looking at something that takes into account the unique factors and conditions of your site, and in many cases what is reasonable and what is proportionate to the circumstances. So we're going to run through some of the main areas that require review and action. But as a general rule and as a piece of advice, if you're ever unsure about some of these aspects and can't get the clarification or specific questions, answers to a specific question, I'd say that assessing the issue and the options available to you and then documenting this activity is a really good starting point, as it demonstrates intent and it demonstrates an element of planning on your behalf. So if we consider cleaning protocols, for example, this would depend on things like occupancy rates, usage areas, maybe whether you've had known cases of infection or not, availability of PPE, whether this is a deep clean or a routine regular cleaning regime. So we've got to think about things sort of dynamically, as well as using the written guidance. As you'll no doubt be aware, there's been a flurry of guidance, just an extraordinary amount of it issued, mainly by the government, but also by the industry and trade bodies. And I'm going to put up key links to this as we go along. There's some on the slide at the moment, and obviously these will be sent out at the end, and I'll also summarise them on a page at the end, just for your sort of ease of reference. In terms of the actual schools opening timetables, you'll obviously be very familiar with this. The government's made some recent announcements relating to their proposals for the reopening of schools. Everyone's in a different position at the moment. Some school sites are closed completely in the lockdown, others are obviously catering for children of key workers. Some are using a hub approach and mothballing sites. But the important thing to note, I think, is that any return to operations is going to be phased. It's going to have to be phased, and that should, in theory, make the management of that from your point of view easier. But it will also mean that it will be really important to conduct regular reviews of policies and procedures as site conditions and occupancy rates change. So it's not going to be possible to put in an opening up protocol set of management plans and then leave those. They're going to have to be constantly reviewed as the landscape changes. In terms of your duties and obligations under health and safety, the position is quite clear. Although there have been some relaxations in some areas relating to running our schools in terms of areas like reporting, perhaps procurement law and the like. There is absolutely no relaxation in the provisions of the key statutory instruments and regulations, such as the Health and Safety at Work Act, Control of Asbestos at Work regulations, all the regulations relating to water, gas safety, electrical safety and the like. So it's really important that that message gets across, that those standards have to be still maintained. So to help you put some structure on this whole section, we've created a checklist, and I've included the whole page on this slide, but I appreciate it's quite small text, and I'm not particularly expecting you to read it all on the webinar. But we'll issue this as a separate attachment at the end, so that you can perhaps use this as a bit of an aid memoir. Obviously, we've got to caveat this to a certain degree and say that it's only guidance. It's not 100% definitive. Every site's different. But addressing everything on this list is not going to make you 100% compliant, because what I've tried to do here is extract the areas that we think are specifically requiring attention due to the coronavirus crisis. And obviously, you've got a whole raft of other compliance obligations that still need to be maintained. But notwithstanding that, I think if you've got all of this covered or on your radar, you should be in a pretty strong position going forwards. So in terms of compliance, you in education settings should be really reviewing your arrangements for all building related systems, but in particular things like the hot and cold water systems. So thinking about Legionella, if you've had a building with very low occupancy, reduced flow rates, particularly if you've had a history of Legionella issues, stagnant water, dead legs and the like, you've got to be particularly conscious of that. Obviously gas safety, checking for leaks and all of the standard protocols. Fire safety, looking at occupancy changes and the impact that that might have on your systems and procedures. Obviously with kitchen equipment, again, ventilation systems, security, anything that's where you've had a reduced occupancy that might affect the actual running of those, might be requiring a review. So I think as a starting point, it's really important to make sure that all of your key tests and certificates and the like all remain current. So an audit of anything that might have expired or be close to expiring would be a really sensible starting point. And as a general principle, looking at the guidance that's been issued, it's really recommended that, if possible, all regular planned and statutory maintenance is kept up throughout any periods of lockdown and low occupancy. If you can avoid it, don't decommission, don't drain down systems. This is actually likely to lead to more problems with recommissioning, perhaps build up of bacteria and the like, which will actually be harder or more expensive to resolve than simply keeping the systems running. One exception to that is gas supplies, where the recommendation is that apart from those serving heating and hot water systems should be isolated where possible to prevent leaks. So things like science labs and the like. Obviously fire safety is critical, particularly when you have only a few people in a building that's usually heavily occupied. So you need to review whether your normal procedures are still effective. So, for example, are fire exits still available without a full opening up regime? Does your fire detection and early warning systems rely on a human element that is no longer in place? Do you have lone working issues with people going into the building in isolated ways that they weren't doing before? Where you're leaving buildings largely unoccupied, you should be checking, obviously, standard good housekeeping practices, such as checking for storage of combustible materials in dangerous locations, stairways, corridors, perhaps even outside where you might be more susceptible to arson attacks during this sort of period of lockdown. Before reoccupation, you'd need to really think about reviewing all of your processes with the mindset of what's changed. So, for example, if you're going to implement restrictions on circulation and access due to the social distancing guidelines that have been issued, how does that impact our evacuation procedures? To go off on a slight tangent, actually, one of our partner organisations, School Property Matters, who are experts on school capacity and curriculum planning, have done some really interesting work modelling the government's proposals on phased classes. And they've concluded that it's actually physically impossible for the proposed 15 students in a standard 30 classroom GTA to actually occupy that space whilst also respecting the 2-metre social distancing rule, which has been suggested by the latest government proposals. So this is no doubt something that's going to be taken up and developed in the sector, perhaps taken up by CST in their discussions with the department. But it really, the early indications are that a maximum of 10 students per class in a standard classroom would be the maximum you could manage to still retain the 2-metre social distancing rule. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Returning to reoccupation actions. Obviously, all of your critical safety systems must be tested and recommissioned. Our advice is to make sure you just allow some time to deal with issues. Don't assume that everything will work straight away or that you'll be able to get specialist contractors in at the drop of a hat. There's bound to be a massive spike in demand for contractors once the June the 1st date is confirmed, or if other dates are given, as and when. In terms of other practical points, think about materials and supplies in terms of spare parts and materials. Cleaning materials and PPE. In terms of PPE, the current guidelines are that face masks are not a requirement for staff and students, although that could change. But they may still be necessary for certain specified operations or personnel within your organisation, such as cleaners, contractors, or those maybe dealing with medical issues within the education setting. You'll have to consider how people access and circulate around the building, trying to implement these social distancing guidelines. As much as possible, you've no doubt been to supermarkets in the last few weeks and seen how things like one-way systems and floor markings and the barriers and the like have been used, and no doubt we're going to have to implement something similar in our school buildings. It's also going to be necessary, I think, to provide enhanced provision of hand sanitising stations, perhaps with additional wall-mounted dispensers on corridors outside classrooms, and obviously at key points of access and entry. So I think that covers the kind of the overview of this checklist that we've created for you. And as I say, I'll issue this out to you. And I obviously would be interested in feedback as well, but hopefully that covers a lot of the main bases. And it is a useful document. I just referred to the wider compliance piece, and please don't try and read this today, but this is an extract from a more detailed checklist of compliance checks. It contains additional information on specific standards, frequency, notes on whether something's statutory or just guidance or best practice. And it's something we go through in more detail when we do dedicated sessions with clients and at events on estates and buildings compliance. And it's too detailed to go into today because it covers a much wider scope. But I just wanted to concentrate today on the coronavirus issues. But I will still issue this out as part of the supporting pack, in case you do want to use this as perhaps a review, as a sanity check on some of your existing regimes or the start of a refreshed system. So moving on to building work and projects themselves. Obviously, one of the key questions people are rightly asking is whether work should be being carried out at their schools at all. And inevitably, there's not a simple one-size-fits-all answer to this. There's a quote here from the government's recent guidelines, obviously stressing that health and safety is critical and still paramount. And the government position is also, with regard to construction sites, it's still very much that construction should be open and should be ongoing, but with the proviso that the work should continue within the published guidelines. it's also the position of the Construction Leadership Council, which has been one of the sort of preeminent trade bodies that have been active in the Covid-19 arena and adapting to giving guidance to the industry, and Public Health England as well. The CLC, Construction Leadership Council, have issued their site operating procedures, which have been, I think, widely circulated, and they're very much in line with the government guidance that was issued earlier this week. So having said that, if it's not possible to work in accordance with these guidelines, then work shouldn't carry on in your schools. But during this period of lockdown, I think a lot of our clients in both academies and trusts have been completing works whilst pupil numbers have been lower and schools have been vacated completely. In some cases, it's actually been a positive benefit to being able to carry out construction works. We've always been saying for years, semi-joking, that working in schools would be a lot easier without children, and suddenly that's what we've been given. But most contractors are now well versed in developing and adapting their risk assessments and method statements to accommodate the current guidelines on social distancing and hygiene standards. So I think these will be provided, and you should obviously just make sure that they are being provided for your approval prior to any works carrying on site. I'm just going to run through a little bit of guidance about actually managing construction projects. This is not so much for yourselves unless you are actually managing or commissioning work directly, but you should really just be using this as a check to see that your contractor and or your professional team have addressed these. And there's also some principles here that you might actually find useful in planning your own internal school operations, whether it's managing your own in-house capabilities, sort of estates management teams and the like. So really looking at the headlines of travel, how are operatives going to get to site, welfare provisions, having enhanced welfare provisions in terms of the cleaning, hand cleaning, phased breaks, good housekeeping, cleanliness of sites, staggered, as I say, staggered breaks and the like. Working practices are going to have to be changed on sites, so it's making sure that contractors have adapted to that. So not having sort of not so much multi-skilled operatives, but really getting a single workman perhaps to be doing one single task in one single area and not crossing over as much as they would have done previously. The logistics side of things, really careful about things like deliveries to site, making sure that delivery drivers aren't getting out of their vehicles unless absolutely necessary, that they're not cross-contaminating, mixing with site staff as much as they would have done previously. And finally, things like meetings. As we all know, we're trying to keep face-to-face meetings to a minimum. That doesn't mean they can't be done, but really they should be trying to keep them down to a minimum of numbers, holding them outside if possible, and obviously respecting all of the guidelines that have been given around that sort of area. So obviously, if you've got a competent contractor or a professional team involved in your projects, this should all be dealt with, but it's just useful, I think, for you to have an overview of some of the key questions and issues, so that you can just carry out a quick check that you're comfortable that they are being dealt with and managed, and not just lip service being paid to them. In terms of the government guidance, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. I'm just really providing it to you for a reference for later on. But since the Construction Leadership Council produced their site operating procedure guidelines, the government also issued their detailed guidance on working safely in construction earlier this week. And this is just a summary of what that is. I think the important thing is to say that although the government haven't made it clear as to whether their guidance or the CLC's guidance takes precedence, having reviewed them, they are largely compatible and largely on the same lines. So I think the industry is kind of coalescing around a way of working. So in summary, I'd say that the default position is that works can and they should be continuing in schools, but obviously with the enhanced checks and provisions, procedures that I've outlined briefly there. And if there are legitimate reasons why works can't continue, why the guidance cannot be adhered to, then works will need to be put on hold or adapted, reduced in scope, or delivered over an extended period of time. And all of those things are talking about the practicalities, but obviously one of the knock-on effects of all of this is going to be an impact on potentially cost and time, and that's when we really need to then look at the contractual implications of some of these changes. So what I wanted to do is just run through the impact of the coronavirus on construction contracts, because it's clear that now that the coronavirus is here for a long term, it's going to have an effect on construction projects, whether they've already been started or whether they're proposed. And the impact is both as a direct result of the virus, perhaps the availability of workforce being reduced, supply chain, but also looking at the government's response to it. Here you can see some of the emergency legislation that's been put in place, obviously all the guidelines that we've discussed already. The primary consideration is obviously remaining as the health and safety of the workforce and the general public, but all of this does impact the ability of parties to a contract to perform their duties, and that obviously is going to have to be dealt with at some point. And the biggest issue is obviously delay. So the virus itself and all of the legislation that's been enacted by the government, every project is going to potentially have a delay, and the way it is dealt with is subtly different depending on whether the issue came about before or after the government intervention. However, in general terms, we really want to think about the basic contract provisions, and I'm going to concentrate mainly on the JCT here, because 90%, if not more, of any contracts that you're involved with in the education setting will be a JCT contract, and if they're not JCT contracts, it's almost certain that you'll have a professional team or external agency that should be able to advise you on this sort of thing. So with a JCT contract, there's a couple of key elements. You may well have heard the term force majeure, and this is identified in contracts as what we call a relevant event, which allows for the contract administrator to extend the time given to complete a project, but it's not listed as a relevant matter. So the difference between the two is that effectively the risk for a force majeure event is shared between the contractor and the employer. It's a neutral event because it's not really under the control of either of the parties. There's no real formal definition of force majeure, and undoubtedly on some large contracts there's going to be a huge amount of legal wranglings and case law around this sort of thing. But generally case law establishes that force majeure is acts or events or circumstances that are outside of the reasonable control of all the parties, and I think it's fairly arguable and fairly obvious that the coronavirus is outside of the control of either you as employers or contractors, and therefore a practical approach in terms of risk sharing relating to that is going to have to be the approach that's widely taken. There is also a clause within the JCT contracts relating to the government exercising any statutory powers that weren't in place at the time of a contract coming into play that directly affect the execution of the work. And obviously seems fairly arguable that an epidemic and the government's reaction to that epidemic would be an event outside of the reasonable control of a contractor or an employer. So things like the lockdown protocols are very much a relevant factor to be considered in your contract. It's unlikely that you'll be dealing with sort of large projects solely without any professional advice, but there are provisions relating to termination of contracts if works are suspended for an extended period of time. But other than for non-payment, there is no provision allowing a contractor to elect to suspend the work. So they would need to, if a contractor is saying they want to stop your building project, and against your advice, they would need to be able to prove that they had to cease working due to circumstances beyond their control, and that there were no reasonable steps that they could take otherwise. That's not to say they won't be able to do that. There are some very legitimate causes at the moment in terms of labour availability, materials availability and the like, but there is a duty on them to prove that. In terms of claims for time, if a contractor is making a claim for an extensions of time for force majeure under the contract, they have got a duty to prove and evidence that the event has delayed the works and by how much. So I think the main thing with this whole coronavirus thing is going to be just making sure that you're on top of dates and times and impacts, so that if a project was perhaps running late before the coronavirus hit, for example, this isn't now used as an excuse for the whole delay, and that contractors are still held to account where necessary for overruns that were predating the coronavirus impact. The contract also requires contractors to demonstrate the use of their best endeavours to mitigate the effects of the delay. So it's really important that a contractor might have to ensure that all their on-site workers are taken off-site to minimise the spread of a disease within their workforce, or it could mean the opposite, that sometimes that they can allow a reduced workforce or even indeed a full workforce on site. So every case is going to be slightly different, but the onus is on the contractor to provide the evidence, but you as employers should be either seeking that directly or through your professional team and making sure that's picked up as an early stage as possible, so that you're not trying to get this evidence back again several months down the line when perhaps potentially there's an argument about timescales or delay. In terms of claims for money, the JCT provides that any relevant matters causing a delay to the events can allow the contractor to claim for loss and expense. As we've said before, this force majeure clause is considered a neutral event, so the contractor cannot claim for additional money relating to that, because it's although it's not the contractor's fault, it's also not the employer's fault. However, what you need to be a little bit careful of is things like instructions issued by the employer or your professional team relating to postponing work or changing on-site access requirements, imposing additional restrictions on the working rate arrangements, or instructions to alter working hours and that sort of thing. So careful thought should be given before issuing any instructions, just to make sure that make sure you've got an understanding of what impact that might have on the contract and on the budget, because a contractor may well have an entitlement to recover any loss and expense incurred due to those sorts of instructions. For example, demobilisation and remobilisation costs could be a legitimate claim. So in practical terms, what should you be doing next with your existing contracts if you've got them in place? Firstly, checking the terms of your existing contracts, making sure that the default provisions that we've talked about, whether they've been amended previously, whether any extensions of time or payments for loss and expense or termination rights might be available to either party, and making sure you've got an understanding of what position you are in. Secondly, if you have entered into any third-party agreements relating to the works, so this could be something like maybe you've agreed to lease part of a building on completion, or you've got a funding agreement in place related to the construction, you need to assess whether you've got any protection against the consequences of delay in the context of any of those agreements with third parties. Probably most importantly, number 3 is just engaging with contractors where contracts might be affected. So leaving aside all the contractual risks and practical implications, it's important that all of these things are managed And since the coronavirus is obviously neither the fault of the contractor or you as employers, it makes sense for the majority of school projects to take a kind of an open and fair and practical approach with contractors, because these sort of proactive discussions probably the best way forward to resolving issues in a sort of timely way, rather than engaging in disputes which are inevitably end up costing both parties more money than resolving things amicably. The fourth point here is just to check your insurance policies. The government has now officially listed COVID-19 as a notifiable disease, and although that doesn't necessarily mean that organisations will be able to claim under their insurance policies, it's certainly, if you are likely to suffer a loss due to this in your construction contract, it might be worth having a conversation with your insurance broker to determine what losses might be covered under your policy. And finally, I think just monitoring developments, because this is, as I've said before, a constantly live and ever-changing environment. The global implications are huge, and new measures could be triggering additional contract provisions and changing the landscape at any time. So I think anything that we say is applicable now, could be out of date within a week. So just keeping on top of things as they develop. That kind of covers off existing contracts. If you've got any works, obviously the other thing you'll be wanting to think about is getting on with other projects. Entering into new contracts, and anything that you can do to protect yourselves in that environment. So going forwards, I think parties to a contract have got to consider potentially amending contracts to make sure that risks associated with coronavirus are expressly allocated between the parties, including how program delays and costs, as well as responsibilities in the results in the event of site closures, might be affected through your contract. So obviously going forward, contractors are not going to want to bear the risk wholly of any negative impacts of the coronavirus, and nor would you necessarily want them to, because that would inevitably lead to longer programs and more expensive build costs. So at the current time, it's definitely impossible to say how long this lockdown is going to last for, but it seems likely that it's going to last for several months. So the most constructive way forward really is to open up an early dialogue with contractors. If you've got tenders that have already been tendered and potential contracts in place, talk to your contractors, see how they want to approach the works, and try and negotiate a fair settlement in terms of maybe changing some of the clauses. But I would say, really importantly, is that if you do change a construction contract, it'd be really advisable to get some professional advice, because this is one of those areas where a little knowledge can be a bit dangerous. So getting some professional advice on amending your contracts would be a very wise move. So that is the bulk of the webinar relating to contracts and building contractual implications and projects. I did just want to spend a few minutes at the end. Appreciate we're running a bit short of time. We've covered a lot of pretty dense content, but I just really wanted to cover some slightly more positive ground and make sure that whilst the current situation is obviously dominating our lives, we do maybe try and keep half an eye on the future. Many of our clients are taking this as an opportunity to review and refresh their estates strategy and management plans. So I wanted to remind you about the Department for Education's Good Estates Management for Schools guidance. Hopefully you're familiar with it, but if you haven't, I really recommend that you look at it. It's a fantastic resource, and we'll come back to it in a minute more specifically, but it covers a huge range of estates management aspects. Don't be overawed by it. You can dip in and out quite effectively, and there are some really good tools and checklists that you can use as a starting point, which I'll come and highlight at the moment. But before we go into details about estates management, what I wanted to do is just get you to try and take some time to think about strategy and approach. So when we approach estates management strategy or any other challenge, we quite often look at it in this way. As you can see on the slide, where are we, where do we want to go, and how do we get there? And that seems logical. But the problem is we quite often get bogged down in the first stage, and that we actually lose sight of the bigger picture and fail to take the important decisions that will actually have the biggest impact on our estates. So we might think, okay, estates management, let's get a situation report, we'll get out all our schools surveyed, we'll do compliance audits. If we're really good, we might have measured surveys, net capacity assessments carried out. These are all bits of brilliant vital information, but then what inevitably happens is the survey throws up that you've got a boiler room that needs attention, or you've got a leaky roof that needs fixing. The compliance audit perhaps shows you need some fire risk assessments carried out, and before you know it, you're off doing these important urgent tasks, but you've perhaps been sidetracked from the really important job of stepping back and looking at why you're doing things. So I would just encourage you to take a subtly different approach and look at things differently by putting the vision first. So thinking about an analogy, we're in May, we're nearly halfway through the year. Did anyone make any New Year's resolutions? The calendar is kind of an arbitrary thing, but for some reason on the 1st of January, there's this kind of crazy thing where everyone decides to reevaluate their lives and say they're going to do one or two things differently. But that's because we want to improve, but what our desires don't always produce the results we want, and that's basically because our resolutions aren't really anything of the kind. They're just a wish list. We're not actually resolving anything. 85% of people, I think, have generally given up their New Year's resolutions by the second week in February. So instead of making resolutions, what we need to do is try and find some concrete steps that can drive some progress, because that's what's going to generate satisfaction and results in your team. So if you can create this compelling vision of what excites you and your team, this will actually drive towards taking decisive and meaningful action. So we just suggest that taking that step back and having an estates vision is absolutely critical. If you look at this, which comes from the Good Estates Management Guidelines, you can see that this is very much the approach that they recommend too. The vision is very much at the top of the tree, and not just the estates vision, but the education vision beyond that. So, we as professionals who run and manage estates are, we're just enablers. It's the education vision that's the critical thing as well. Where is the organisation headed? What are the goals? And then how are we going to adapt our estates to meet those goals and objectives? And if you can get buy-in from others in your organisation and together create this vision for your school or college or trust, that's when the good things start to happen in terms of getting onto this virtuous cycle of improvement, of fundraising, money saving and investment that will help you to move from this model of firefighting to taking real proactive sort of strategic steps forward. And I know that sounds easy, but life out there often looks a bit like this. We've got some tired 1960s school, crystal windows, flat roofs, depressing design. But even at a very simple school level like this, working with a finance director at this school who had the vision and the drive over a very short period of time, we managed to get funding for new roofs, and then we secured commercial funding for PV panels that went on those roofs. That generated a small income that was used to pump prime a project to replace external cladding, which has made a massive impact on both the look and feel of the building. And then we helped them to fund and deliver a new boiler room. So, even at a relatively modest local level, it's not a shiny new purpose-built school, but it's now a safe, dry, warm, comfortable space that allows really effective learning. And there's a whole story to tell in a moment about renewables. We'll touch on that in a second. So just to sort of close this out, just wanted to, one of the tools I mentioned right at the beginning of this was some of the checklists on the Good Estates Management for Schools guidance. And this is a good one to look at if you're just thinking about estate strategy generally. Some of the key questions: are we managing the estate effectively? Do we have a good understanding of the condition of our buildings? We've obviously talked a lot about compliance today, so are we complying with our legal obligations? Have we looked at all of the funding opportunities available to us, and the funding that we are spending, are we getting best value for that? So without going into too much detail today, I just wanted to really float some of these ideas past you and get you to think about maybe just one or two of these questions, especially if now might be a good time to be looking at your estate's vision and how you can make positive change on the way your estates are run. And actually, one of the key areas that you could tackle is the subject of our next webinar, which is going to be on transforming energy management. So I wrote a piece in Trust, which is the CST's magazine last month, about the huge opportunities there are in, particularly for multi-academy trusts, to save money, improve learning environments, make their operations more sustainable, and reduce carbon emissions, all with little or no capital outlay. And so my colleague John Coyles, who many of you will know, will be leading a session at the same time as this next week on this subject, and I hope you can join in. Please register in the same way as you did for this one. As promised, I've got a page at the back here, and as I say, these links should be live when I send you out the slide pack, but a summary of some of the links to some of the key documents and resources that I've referenced in this presentation. So we'll send that out. And just to remind you, as I say, about our next webinar, the Transforming Energy Management, please do submit some questions, either direct to me, my email is on here, or you can do it via the Q&A panel on this webinar. If anything that I've said today has thrown up any further questions, or you need clarification, you've got any issues or help that you might require with your estates. I hope you found this session useful. Thanks very much for joining. It's really nice to see some of our existing clients are logged in, and also obviously hope to be able to see you in person sometime, and also perhaps meet some of these new people that have registered to the event in person once we start to come out of this current situation. So I wish you all the very best in the coming weeks, and really hope that you and your colleagues and families stay safe and healthy. Thank you very much.